This address by John Hilton was given at BYU's Campus Education Week on August 17, 2009.
Hello, my name is John Hilton III, and welcome to BYU Education Week. Have you ever been walking around in a public place and seen a sign that just made no sense? Like this sign. When you read, touching wires causes instant death, $200 fine, you kind of wonder, which is worse? Or how about this sign? Please be safe. Do not stand, sit, climb, or lean on zoo fences. If you fall, animals could eat you, and that might make them sick. Sometimes if you see a sign like this, you might ask yourself, why? Why is this sign here? And perhaps sometimes that happens with the commandments. When we hear of a standard or a teaching of the gospel, sometimes there's a temptation to ask, why? Why can't I study date in high school? Why does the media I watch or participate in have such an impact in my life? Why does it matter if I tattoo my body? Unlike these signs, which seem to have, in some cases, no good reason, the commandments we have always have a reason. I love this quote from Elder Glenn L. Pace. He said, "I've always been one that wants to know why. On the wall of our kitchen is a picture of a hen talking to her chicks with the caption, 'Because I'm the mommy, that's why.' However, we have been given good, logical, and spiritual reasons for the vast majority of things we are asked or commanded to do." When it comes to the commandments, there are great reasons why we have them. And today our purpose is to talk about some of the doctrinal reasons why for the commandments that we have. Sometimes perhaps when we're confronted with someone who says, well, why do you live this commandment? Why does your church believe this? We say, well, that's just because of what the prophet said, or that's what my mom said. And those are good responses. However, there are more. Elder David A. Bednar, the Quorum of the 12, explained one of the reasons why it's so important that we know the why. He said, "It concerns me as I see young people in our church who know all the correct things they should do and do not have a clue as to why. Do we understand why?" Now notice this next phrase. If we do not understand the why, then the power available to us through the doctrine of Christ will not be evident in our lives. Let's consider a scriptural example of how understanding the why could bring power into one's lives. In Moses chapter 5, we read of an account of Adam offering sacrifice to the Lord. This is Moses chapter 5, starting in verse 5. "And he gave unto them commandments that they should worship the Lord their God and should offer the firstlings of their flocks for an offering unto the Lord. And Adam was obedient unto the commandments of the Lord. And after many days an angel of the Lord appeared unto Adam, saying, Why dost thou offer sacrifices unto the Lord? And Adam said unto him, I know not, save the Lord commanded me." Now think about that. For many days, Adam was obedient to the commandments, even though he didn't know the reason why. Verse 7, "And then the angel spake, saying, This thing is a similitude of the sacrifice of the only begotten of the Father, which is full of grace and truth." Once Adam knew that this sacrifice he was doing was representative of Jesus Christ, can you see how the next time he sacrificed, it was probably a more powerful experience for him? Before, although he was obedient, he didn't know why, but now that he knew the why, when he understood that a sacrifice would represent Jesus Christ, it became much more meaningful. Similarly, for us in our lives, when we understand the why behind the commandments, there's a power that becomes more and more available to us. So let's start out by talking about, in general, why should I keep the commandments? Doctrine and Covenants section 82 gives us a great key. We learn a synonym for the word commandments in these verses. Doctrine and Covenants section 82, starting in verse 8. "And again I say unto you, I give unto you a new commandment, that you may understand my will concerning you. Or in other words, I give unto you directions." So commandments and directions are equated with each other. And sometimes we think, oh, what a restrictive commandment. Maybe we're talking about, someone says, why can't we date till we're 16? Do we think that the church leaders are standing around somewhere and they're like, what can we do that's really going to bug the youth of the church? Ooh, I've got an idea. How about no dating till 16? Oh yeah, put that in the pamphlet. No, the Lord says, I give you commandments, or in other words, direction. The commandments are to guide us and to help us do things that will lead us to Jesus Christ. I'm reminded of a story a friend of mine told. This friend was a tough military guy, and he was really worried about what would happen when he had children, especially daughters, and when guys would try to date his daughters. So this was his plan he told me about. He said, you know how when you walk into some houses, they have a little stand for umbrellas? Well, in my house, I'm going to have a stand with baseball bats. And I'll have a bat for each of my daughter. And on the bat, it will be my daughter's name, and then I'll list all of the dating rules. So when a young man comes to date my daughter, I'll give him the bat, and he'll have to read all the rules and then sign his name on the bat, acknowledging that he has read and understands our dating rules. Then I'll take the bat and say, son, if you break the rules will break you. What a profound statement that is. If you break the rules will break you. One reason why the Lord gives us commandments is because the commandments provide us with direction in our lives. They help us know the things that we need to do. I've had a personal experience with this. Once while I was at a zoo, I saw one of those signs that seems a little unusual. It said, don't stand too close to the giraffes. But they allowed you to feed the giraffes. You could pay $1 and get some lettuce, and as you could hand the giraffe some lettuce, he would just reach out his tongue and slurp it up. And it was really fun. And I liked my giraffe so much I wanted to have a picture with the giraffe. So even though the sign said not to, I stood by the giraffe, and just as they were getting ready to take the picture, the giraffe kind of looked at me and went like this. Whack! And smacked me in the head. If you think giraffes are nice, loving creatures, you're wrong. I had a bump for weeks. So in the final picture, I decided to keep my distance from the giraffe. There was a sign, and it was put in place to give me direction. It wasn't to impede my freedom, and it wasn't to hurt me. Power comes into our lives when we keep the commandments. Let's take another look at a reason why we should keep the commandments by examining a scripture chain. Let's start in Doctrine and Covenants, section 93. We often hear of the light of Christ and how the light of Christ helps us to choose and discern between good and evil. Doctrine and Covenants, section 93, verse 28, gives us a key as to how we can have the light of Christ in our lives. Verse 28, he that keepeth his commandments receiveth truth and light, until he is glorified in truth and knoweth all things. So why should I keep the commandments? Because as I keep the commandments, I receive light from the Lord. Now let's turn to Doctrine and Covenants, section 50, verse 24, and see how this verse adds to section 93, verse 28. That which is of God is light, and he that receiveth light and continueth in God receiveth more light, and that light groweth brighter and brighter until the perfect day. So as I keep the commandment, I receive light. And as I receive light and continue to keep the commandments, I receive more light. And the more light I receive, the easier it is to discern between good and evil. So it kind of creates an upward spiral of light in my life. The more I obey, the more light I receive. The more light I receive, the easier it is to obey. The more I continue to obey, the more additional light I will receive. Another reason why it's so important to keep the commandments is simply because as we keep the commandments, we are happy. I love this quote from the prophet Joseph Smith. He said, God never has, he never will institute an ordinance or give a commandment to his people that is not calculated in its nature to promote that happiness which he has designed, and which will not end in the greatest amount of good and glory to those who would become the recipients of his law and ordinances. So you don't need to figure out a complicated formula. It's simple. If we keep the commandments, we're happy as we have righteous motives. And if we don't keep the commandments, well, we've already been taught wickedness never was happiness. Perhaps a graphic illustration of this is found in this series of photos. There was a picture taken of a drug user every year, and you can just see, looking in her eyes and her countenance as time goes on in a life not living the commandments, how increasingly she becomes less and less and less happy. In our lives, the same thing is true. If we break the commandments, we do not receive happiness. But when we keep the commandments, happiness flows. So to summarize, why is it so important to keep the commandments? We've talked about 3 reasons. Number 1, commandments give us guidance and direction. Number 2, keeping the commandments can give us light and truth. And 3rd, keeping the commandments helps us to be happy. So with any commandment, these principles will apply. Let's turn now and talk about some commandments perhaps a little bit more specifically. And maybe we can start with the media. Why can't I listen to and watch whatever I want? Some people say. This is an increasingly important question for us in the world in which we live. In August of 2001, President Henry B. Eyring gave a remarkable prophecy. He said that LDS youth cannot just go with the flow anymore and expect to remain righteous. He then prophesied of what is to come in the future. He said the flow has become a flood and soon will be a torrent. It will be a torrent of sounds and sights and sensations which invite temptation and offend the Spirit of God. Just 2 months after President Eyring's address, on October 23, 2001, the first iPod was introduced to the general public. 2 years later, the first video iPod was introduced. And today, even older iPods can hold over 20,000 songs and 100 hours of video. And you can see that it's not just the iPod, but all sorts of cultural phenomenon like YouTube, Google Images, MySpace, Facebook. There are so many ways that we are inundated with the media. So if there's ever a generation that needs to be able to answer the question, why does what I watch or listen to matter so much? It's the generation of today. We can see one clear chain of events that helps us understand why what we watch and listen to is so important. Whatever we see or hear will affect what we think. What we think will affect what we desire. What we desire will affect our actions. The sum of our actions will equal our character, and what we become, our character, will determine our eternal destiny. It all begins with what we think, and what we think is so very much influenced by what we see and hear. In Jacob chapter 2, verse 5, the prophet Jacob says, I can tell you concerning your thoughts, how that you are beginning to labor in sin. Have you ever had an experience where you watched a movie and had a dream that was similar to the movie you watched? Or have you had experiences where after watching a certain movie, you were frightened because it was a scary movie and you were jumping around no matter what happened to you? What we see, no doubt, affects us. And if I were just to throw out, for example, a few lines from songs, don't shout them out, but just think to yourself, could you finish the blank? I still haven't found what I know you could do it. How about this one? Everything I do it. Even though those songs are old, I know in your mind you think, oh yeah, I know that, because it's a tune you've heard over and over, and it's affected your thoughts, and it becomes a part of us. This is one reason why what we see and hear matters so much. In fact, the For Strength of Youth pamphlet plainly tells us, whatever you read, listen to, or look at has an effect on you. Therefore, choose only entertainment and media that uplift you. Good entertainment will help you to have good thoughts and make righteous choices. I heard of an interesting academic study that focused on this fact that what we see affects us. This study was done in part by Randall Wright and involved not only members of the church. This is a study of teenagers of all religions and those of no religion at all across several different states, a large teenage population sample. What they did was they noted how many R-rated movies these teenagers had watched in the past 2 years, and also their willingness to have premarital sex. And as you can see, the more times a person had viewed an R-rated movie, the more likely they were to have premarital sex. Now, clearly this is a correlation and not causation, but still it's an interesting correlation that those who watched more and more depictions of on-screen sex and violence were themselves more likely to participate and engage in premarital sex. The idea that what we watch affects us is true, and it is powerful. Now, for a second reason why the media we watch is so important, let's take a look at this visual. What do you see as you look at it? Sometimes people just see a series of dots, but if you look carefully, you should be able to see a Dalmatian. Can you see the Dalmatian in the photo? Its nose it's kind of like it's sniffing at the ground. You can see the left ear. Now, the real challenge, once you've been able to help yourself see the Dalmatian, is to look at the picture and try not to see the Dalmatian. For most people, once they've seen this image, it becomes impossible to look at the image and not see the Dalmatian. And the message of this for us is that media is very hard to unsee or unhear. Once you've seen something, it's difficult to get rid of it. For example, modern prophets have taught in the For Strength of Youth pamphlet, pornography is a poison that weakens your self-control, changes the way you see others, and causes you to lose the guidance of the Spirit, and can even affect your ability to have normal relationship with your future spouse. Pornography becomes something once seen that's hard to unsee, hard to get it out of our minds. Lest we become discouraged, I love the quote that the scriptures are the best washing machine for our thoughts. So if we've been accidentally exposed to things that are wrong, we can pray to have those thoughts out of our minds. We can seriously study the scriptures. But know that one of the reasons why it's so important not to watch or listen to inappropriate media is it's hard to stop seeing it, the flashbacks in your mind. This quote also highlights a third reason, and that is that the media can skew our perspective. It changes the way you see others. And this skew of the view can have a very negative impact in our lives. I remember myself as a teenager, there was a certain television show that I began watching. And after watching it for a few weeks, I noticed that my view of the world was changing. The television show was about wealthy teenagers and the parties they had, and I started to wonder to myself, how come I don't drive a nicer car? How come I don't have a hot tub? And I started to see that my way of thinking about things was changed by the media that I was watching. And I'm glad I recognized that and decided to stop watching that show, because the media we watch will change our view. So to sum up, as far as media goes, why does it matter what I listen to or watch? So we've discussed media affects our actions. It can be hard to unsee or to unhear. And media can skew our perspective in inappropriate ways. Let's take a look at another commandment. Why should I fast? Now, I know that there are many people listening right now who fast diligently. But if someone were to come up to you and say, well, why do you fast? What would you say? Do you have a good reason? Are there doctrinal reasons for fasting that you know of? Let's turn to Isaiah chapter 58. This is my favorite chapter on fasting, and we learn several reasons from Isaiah why the fast is so important. Now, apparently, some of the people in Isaiah's time were fasting in a way that might sound familiar to you. Have any of you ever gone downstairs, poured that big bowl of cereal, crackling in the milk, and as you reach in that first bite, your mom yells, "Hey, it's fast Sunday." Oh. And you say, well, do I have to fast? Why? And it seems like some people were doing that in Isaiah's day. Look in chapter 58, verse 5. The Lord is speaking. He says, Is it such a fast that I have chosen? A day for man to afflict his soul? Is it to bow down his head as a bulrush and to spread sackcloths and ashes under him? Have you seen people like that? They kind of walk around. My soul is so afflicted. I'm so hungry. And then I love the question. He asks, wilt thou call this a fast and an acceptable day to the Lord? If I'm moaning because it's so hard to fast, is that acceptable? And then he goes on to teach us some powerful reasons about fasting. Verse 6, is not this the fast that I have chosen? To loose the bands of wickedness, to undo the heavy burdens, and to let the oppressed go free, and that you break every yoke. Let's just stop right there in verse 6. Is not this the fast I have chosen to loose the bands of wickedness? We'll talk, for example, about fast offerings, and I think that's a common reason that people would think of for why we fast. But notice that the first reason Isaiah mentions is to loose the bands of wickedness. Fasting helps us keep the commandments for at least two reasons. Number one, as we fast, a very appropriate thing to fast for is for the strength to overcome temptations that we have. But second, one of the major causes of sin is a lack of self-control. And fasting helps us gain that self-control. Let's look at how. If we can control our natural desire to sustain ourselves through food, we can better account for our natural desire for selfishness. If we can pass on a glass of orange juice in the morning, we will have greater ability to pass on a drink of alcohol at night. If we have the willpower to abstain from pre-mealtime food, we will have increased power to